Welcome to Chapter 23, which focuses on World War I. When he was elected president, Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, was more concerned about domestic problems. He wasn't so much concerned about international problems because, quite honestly, at the time, the world was pretty much at peace then. He appointed William Jennings Bryan his Secretary of State, and he liked Bryan because he was not a professional diplomat. So we hear a lot of times today about how people say there are too many Washington insiders in the White House, that sort of thing. That's what Wilson liked about Bryan. He was not a Washington insider in the way of being a diplomat. So he really kind of liked this idea of a common guy who was not a professional diplomat. And they both also agreed that the United States should be the world's moral compass. So all other nations then, according to Bryan and President Wilson, would look to the U.S. for, what's right, what's wrong, that sort of thing. Now, there were some issues that were developing in South America and the Caribbean, and the U.S. almost went to war with Mexico. Despite his urge to stay out of things in terms of international war, Wilson did get involved a few times. There was, in 1914, a treaty with Nicaragua where the U.S. gave $3 million to the Nicaraguans for the right to build a second Atlantic-Pacific Canal. And then in 1915 and 1916, the U.S. government intervened with military in Haiti to put down disorder and the Dominican Republic to prevent Germany and other European nations from taking over. Now, it looks like, we had some sort of interest in protecting these people. Yes, that's true. That was part of the U.S. mission. However, we had also been loaning money to the Dominican Republic during this fight. So by stepping in and intervening there, then it meant that we were actually protecting those unpaid debts to us. So that's another reason that the U.S. got involved in the Dominican Republic. So Wilson saw this as helping them to stay honest, though. He didn't look at it as saving the Dominican Republic. He looked at it as an opportunity to let them repay their U.S. debt. I mentioned previously that the U.S. almost went to war with Mexico, so here's what happened. There was a civil war in Mexico where there was an attempt to make reforms that were fought by Mexican aristocrats and the Catholic Church. So Wilson refused to recognize the government who had this democratic leader murdered in their civil war. So it wasn't enough that Wilson refused to recognize that Mexican government that was currently in power, but he put some pressure on the British to also withdraw their recognition of the government in power. So that means that Mexico is going to retaliate at this point. They arrested a crew that was on an American naval ship, and even though they were released, the commanding officer demanded punishment. And the Mexican commandant apologized, but refused the requested 21-gun salute to the American flag. At this point, Wilson asked Congress for the authority to make sure Mexico showed respect to American rights. He said he wanted what was best for the people of Mexico, which in his mind was life based on liberty and human rights. Later, Mexico granted the U.S. authority to enter to capture Pancho Villa, who threatened the new Mexican government. General Pershing entered with a large troop, which really upset the American government because it looked more like Pershing was leading an invasion of a whole nation, not just coming to capture one person who threatened the new government that had been established. So Wilson realized the pending war overseas, so he ordered Pershing to return back to Texas, and he sent a diplomat to smooth things over with Mexico. As a result, we see that Mexicans begin not trusting the United States at this point. And also, at the same time, Wilson's desire not to go to war with Mexico kind of gave Mexican revolutionaries the freedom to do what they wanted in Mexico. It also, though, solidified Wilson's foreign policy, which was moralism, the U.S. leading by example, leading with the idea of morals, teaching right from wrong to these other nations. Also, self interest, missionary interventionism, and a very staunch anti war sentiment. This editorial cartoon shows President Woodrow Wilson teaching a lesson to three small countries, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Mexico. You can tell by the graduation cap that is on Wilson's head that it symbolizes knowledge. So he was a very knowledgeable person. He had even been president of Princeton University before becoming president of the United States. He was also a minister's son and a historian, so this idea of preaching and teaching went hand in hand for Wilson. It came very naturally to him, which explains why his stance on foreign involvement was one, to avoid war, and two, that the United States should be the moral compass. And here in this cartoon, we see him lecturing to these small, childlike countries here, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Mexico, because they needed to learn this lesson. So it wasn't just Wilson and his government cabinet that wanted to avoid war. At the time, most Americans really wanted to avoid war too. There, were a couple of situations that could have arisen from this. As a nation of immigrants ourselves, it could have inflamed relationships here in the United States, and no one wanted that. And we have to keep in mind, though, that there were recent immigrants to the U.S. who knew very well of the oppression that some of these other countries were facing. So while the majority of Americans wanted to avoid war, some of these recent immigrants can see why, very clearly see why. A majority of Americans were pro-ally forces. That would be England and France, and because they also had democracies. The United States would not help Germany, which was among the Central Powers, because it was militant and arrogant. When we think of propaganda, we always think of it as something someone else does, but it's important to understand that the Allies, the Central Powers, and the Americans also participated in propaganda. So France and England controlled the news flow to the American press through press wires, international press information. The Germans focused on hate and destruction, which did not appeal to the U.S. So they are at a disadvantage because the Germans don't have access to the news flow to the American press. However, France and England do. And so they even get some of these German-produced brochures or advertisements that teach hate and destruction, and they send those to the American press, so that now we're beginning in the United States to see a very hate-filled Germany, and we're starting to see that it offends the United States, who really believes that everyone should be treated fairly. So despite this idea of neutrality, Wilson really does favor the Allies, basically because he himself was an Anglophile. An Anglophile is not something horrible, okay? It's just a person who is really fond of England or Great Britain. So as a student, he studied British law and English literature. So for that reason, he has a very strong connection to the culture of Great Britain. And for that reason, he really supported the Allies. It would seem that after a country had declared itself neutral, that it would be allowed to trade with all countries involved. However, that was not the case. The British violated the right of neutral countries by limiting trade. And ultimately, though, with the United States, the British actually agreed to buy enough to make up for the lost German market that the Americans would lose in terms of commerce, and promised American businesses that they would be compensated for their losses after the war. So, while yes, they did violate our and limit trade with us, they did offer some pretty good makeups there. When Germans began seeking ships, including cargo ships, Americans' relationships with Germany naturally became very strained. While most Americans didn't want war, the war spirit starts to rise after Germany sinks the Lusitania, a British ship with some American passengers on board. Wilson demanded an apology and a promise of no future attacks. Germany basically said, "Sorry for your loss, but that's it." Wilson sent 2 more strongly worded letters, but nothing changed. The Secret Service, the U.S. Secret Service, located a briefcase with contents that showed German operations in the U.S. to sabotage munitions factories. That began to change things. A German agent blew up a United States bridge, and then various other explosions started being linked back to Germany. Public mood in the United States began to change toward preparedness at this point. The United States negotiated the Sussex Pledge, in which Germany pledged to abandon all of their shoot-on-sight attempts to shoot at boats unless they were enemy warships. The British were not happy with the agreement, but Germany actually did follow it for a while. In the election of 1916, President Wilson was reelected, beating Charles Evan Hughes, who was a Supreme Court justice and representing the Republican Party in that race. It was a close race, though. Wilson did come out on top, though. He saw this as a vote for peace. But we're also on the road to war during this vote for peace. Wilson offers to negotiate between allies and Central Powers because he believes that this election has shown that people really want to maintain peace. He's going to try diplomacy first. He offers to negotiate between the allies and the Central Powers. Germany decides to disobey the Sussex Pledge at this point. They're going to give that up. So Wilson severs all ties with Germany at that point. On March 9th, Wilson announced his arming of ships. Then, just less than a month later, on April 2nd, 1917, Wilson asked Congress to declare war. The Senate passed that declaration on April 4th, and the House approved it on April 6th, bringing the United States officially into World War I. Entering the war means that the United States has to begin a draft again. It's the first draft since the Civil War. And this draft grew the army from 200,000 people to 4 million. And these people were trained at 32 different camps. We sent 2 million troops to France. The Navy guarded troop and supply ships. The war cost the United States $33 billion. $9 billion of that was actually in the way of loans given to allies. 25% of this money was raised in progressive taxes. People with large incomes paid up to 75% for taxes. In terms of mobilization, so that we could prepare for war and sending troops out, we created the War Industries Board, which built new production facilities for ships and arms. It also found new sources for raw materials, which was important. And This War Industries Board served as the purchasing agent for the Allies. Also, food production expanded because we had a lot of people to feed with this war. We had campaigns. Also, Herbert Hoover, who we will talk about in the next chapter a little bit. Herbert Hoover was named to head the food production effort, and they promoted meatless and wheatless campaigns to remind Americans to not eat meat for one night a week and not to have bread for one night a week, to save those things so that they could go to soldiers. With all these men gone to war, it opens up new opportunities for minorities in the workplace. Thousands of women joined the workforce, and they got equal pay for equal work in war industries. Women worked in the war in medical roles, like in the Red Cross. They also helped in the Salvation Army. And then thousands of African American men and women left the South for wartime factory jobs up north, where they made high wages. As I mentioned before, Americans also practiced propaganda. We had our own propaganda war. We created the Committee on Public Information, which was led by journalist George Creel, who had this gift of storytelling. And the goal of this committee was to mobilize the mind of the world, to get everyone on the same page, to create this patriotic feeling, and for people to want to join the effort, no matter what their role was. And under Creel's leadership, there were some beautiful recruiting posters that were made. There was a staff of lecturers who went around and talked about why war was necessary and what we could all do to improve our chance of winning and that sort of thing. It just really encouraged Americans to fight. And regarding civil liberties during the war, Congress passed the Espionage Act, which gave strict penalties for aiding the enemy, encouraging insubordination, or refusing duty in the armed forces. And the Trading with Enemy Act, the government could confiscate and run German-owned businesses here in the U.S. and censor international communications and the foreign language press. So not only are we creating our own propaganda, but we're stepping in and we're controlling what people see, what's being sent to them from the outside. In 1918, the Sedition Act is passed, which makes it illegal to use profane or abusive language about the Constitution, the flag, or the armed forces. Here's one of those posters we were just talking about, designed by Montgomery Flagg, who was an important illustrator of the era. Produced this poster that showed even boys and girls could help in the war effort. As you learned from Wilson's 14 points in the last slide, you know that one of the most important things to Wilson for making peace wasn't just to wrap up this particular war, the war that we now know as World War I, but to create a situation so that there would never be another world war. And part of that plan, devised by Wilson, was to create a League of Nations. The League of Nations was developed, however, the United States did not join. Congress did not join that. And Wilson contended that without the United States' involvement in the League of Nations, that another world war would break out within a generation. And he was right.